Ubisoft knew very well that they just couldn't suffer another failure. With their terrible 2024 that included an underperforming Star Wars Outlaws and an absolutely disastrous Skull and Bones, a lackluster Assassin's Creed release is the last thing they needed. And yeah, they definitely knew that. That's why they had multiple delays that pushed the game out from its original release in November of 2024 out 4 months to March 2025. They clearly wanted to polish and refine the experience because that's just how bad 2024 was for them. What's that one quote that everyone loves to refer to in these situations? A bad game is bad forever, and a delayed game is eventually good. Anyway, Assassin's Creed Shadows, as we know, was shrouded in a bunch of different controversies, from the introduction to a black samurai main character to a female lead, as well as the whole destroying shrines and temples thing that has actually since been patched. Now, since release, I've spent about 50 hours with Shadows, completing the main quest and a bunch of side activities to really tie together my experience with the game. Throughout my playtime, my general feelings towards it ranged quite a bit. There were moments where I felt like the game was the best I've seen in the series in quite some time. Other moments where the game just felt like it made a ton of questionable decisions for really no good reason at all. So this video is going to be everything I have to say about Assassin's Creed Shadows. Now, if you're watching this video, you likely know a fair amount about Assassin's Creed series in general and have likely played a number of titles in the series. You also probably have a favorite. If you do, go ahead and comment your personal favorite down below and just watch the flood of people who either agree or disagree with you to begin. I think it's only fair that I share my personal likes and dislikes as far as the series goes so you can get a better idea of what I think a good Assassin's Creed game is. So, here we go. I thought Valhalla was actually kind of good. I thought Mirage was well below average. I found Origins to be better than Odyssey, mostly due to its setting and main character. Of games made before this decade, I mean in the past 10 years, I took a liking to Black Flag the most. Now, feel free to hit the like and dislike button accordingly. With that out of the way, let's start our discussion on Assassin's Creed Shadows. I'll start out by saying that I found AC Shadows to be the most refined Assassin's Creed experience that we've ever had. I mean that in terms of gameplay, the parkour, and the general systems such as the skill trees and the loadouts. I'll dig into each of these in depth in later sections. I also feel like Shadows suffers from what I call an identity crisis, and that statement I'm sure is quite obvious as to what I'm referring to. The game offers up two main characters to play as, those being Yasuke and Naoe. By now, we are all familiar with Yasuke, for better or for worse. He's a samurai that excels in combat and doesn't really follow your prototypical assassin archetype. Naoe, on the other hand, is an expert assassin creeping in and out of Shadows to execute anyone in her path. I just mentioned how I feel Shadows suffers from an identity crisis, and I think now would be a good time to dig into that. Over the years, the AC formula has changed quite a bit. The days of just sneaking around rooftops, executing your target with a single strike of a dagger, are gone. This change became most evident, in my opinion, with Assassin's Creed Origins. This is where Ubisoft really went down the RPG path with the damage numbers, the loot, and more focused on abilities and melee combat, something the series was obviously really never known for prior. From there, each mainline title continued down this path, adding more systems on top of the existing ones, more abilities, more weapons, more skills, and so on. You get the picture. The focus on being that stealthy assassin wasn't completely gone, but it was diminished quite heavily for the sake of creating a game that was probably more approachable to a casual crowd. The series became more of an action RPG with a hint of stealth mechanics. I pose a genuine question to you here. What do you think sells better? A game where stealth is the main selling point, or a game where you get to play as a Spartan or Viking that allows you to rip your enemies to shreds? My guess would be the latter. That's exactly what Ubisoft honed in on with its Odyssey and Valhalla titles. And you know what? I actually enjoyed the combat in Valhalla to the point where I don't even think I used stealth at all in that particular game. But Ubisoft had a bit of a conundrum. Fans of the classic AC experience did not like the direction of where the series was going at all, and that's totally fair. Mirage came and went with an absolute thud, a game that went back to the roots of being an assassin and only an assassin, was met with mixed reactions from critics and the player base as well. despite, in general, it being a smaller game. There was just a lack of depth in a number of systems. It was a step back to what the original recipe was, but maybe too big of a step back for the modern AC crowd. It's hard to remove so many different parts of the game once a player has them and expect them to be happy with that decision. So, this is where Shadows comes in. A game where Ubisoft felt like they would be able to appease both crowds. The people who like to sneak around and be super stealthy, well, you can play as Naue. For those who like to go toe to toe in combat, well, there's Yasuke for you. This seems like a simple solution, right? Everyone would be happy with being able to approach the game how they want. However, this approach presents a fundamental problem with the game that really shouldn't exist in the first place. Let me start with the elephant in the room, Yasuke. I'm not going to comment on the factual evidence of the character himself. I think the game obviously embellishes a lot for the sake of storytelling. The problem with Yasuke is he himself, as a playable character, does not fit with what the Assassin's Creed series is fundamentally known for. Now, this ends up being sort of a catch 22 for Yubi. People wonder why the formula hasn't evolved and why we keep essentially getting the same game over and over again. But when they do try to switch up the formula by adding what is basically a whole new playstyle to the series, the reception ends up being mixed at best. But I get it, and honestly, I agree with that sentiment. Yasuke is there to satisfy the itch for players who just want to go into these castles and temples without needing to sneak around. You can walk in and clear a whole castle in about 5 minutes, then walk back out with some new loot to boot. This playstyle goes against the essence of what the series is about, but at the same time, that's precisely the playstyle that has been the norm for the series as of late. Eivor and Bayek and other assassins can be played similarly, but if you wanted to actually play as a prototypical assassin with those characters, like jumping from rooftop to rooftop, you can do so with them. With Yasuke, this functionality is completely stripped away. You won't be scaling rooftops, you basically won't really be playing as an assassin, so you might as well just call the game Creed at that point. I'm genuinely not an Assassin's Creed purist. You can refer earlier to the video about which games in the series that I like best, and that should tell you everything you need to know. Playing as Yasuke also strips away some very fundamental actions that are core to the Assassin's Creed experience, like climbing atop towers to survey and synchronize the land around you. Yasuke simply just can't do this. He instead comments on how it would be a good challenge for Naue. So you'd have to come back later as Naue to scale that same tower. This is what I mean about the game having an identity crisis with the addition of Yasuke. I understand having the choice offers up an additional playstyle, but it's fairly annoying having to switch back and forth between characters in order to complete certain activities. And this is just one of the activities. There are a few others that just simply can't be done. I guess now would be a good time to transition into talking about the actual gameplay. So, the theme of there being a dichotomy in playstyles is likely going to be a reoccurring one in this video. Gameplay in Shadows is basically a tale of two sides. Naue plays like your prototypical assassin, jumping between rooftop, extinguishing lights to create darkness, and moving from bush to bush. I would think what's there would make any Assassin's Creed fan happy because I feel like the game really offers up a very good stealth based approach. Naue has many tools at her disposal to clear out camps, and as I was playing on the hardest difficulty, using everything I had available was absolutely crucial to clearing out whole encampments without anyone seeing me. There's even the whole new darkness mechanic that makes it so hiding in shadows is a viable strategy to assassinating an enemy. It's not something I personally use often during my playthrough, but it's a neat idea that can be improved upon in future AC titles. Naue is the hidden blade wielder, allowing her to execute enemies with one strike. Now, the game by default makes it so that more elite enemies are not able to be assassinated with that one strike. But there is a setting to toggle that and change it, and I think that's a fair way to address that issue. I personally played with that setting off, so some targets had some health removed when struck, but they would end up not dying, eventually leading to a melee fight. There are times where I considered changing that setting, especially when I felt like I did such a good job being stealthy and only to have to actually fight the last target. In general, I found that this was one of the most refined stealth experiences to date. Ubisoft clearly took everything they've learned in past games and put it all together in Shadows. You now have the ability to even go prone in smaller brush areas, giving you more avenues for approaching your targets. It's a nice addition that I actually use quite often to escape from pursuers as well. The hardest difficulty actually makes it so enemy detection is faster and that they're more alert, so I enjoyed the challenge quite a bit. Of course, with Nawe, you can bypass the whole stealth thing, but in comparison to Yasuke, she's nowhere near as tanky or as strong. One or two hits from an elite enemy usually spells the end for Nawe. This is something they definitely needed to do because consider the fact that if Nawe had the same health pool as Yasuke, then what reason would someone have to play as Yasuke to begin with? So moving on from Nawe, let's actually discuss Yasuke's gameplay. He is essentially the answer to the playstyle that players have been accustomed to from the last couple Assassin's Creed entries. Yasuke approaches combat much more aggressively than Nawe does. While you, of course, can technically sneak around as Yasuke, and by that I mean go prone or crouch in a bush, that's typically not going to be the way you play him when you're controlling him. At least for me, the way I used him was when I approached a castle or a temple that I found to be full of enemies that Nawe would struggle with. Normally, the elite type enemies that would take far too long to kill if I was playing as Nawe. In my opinion, in general, though, I found Yasuke to be a little bit overpowered. I was able to clear out castles with relative ease, even on the hardest difficulty setting. But at this point, I doubt Yubi would actually nerf his power because I think players would end up just complaining. So I think now would be a good time to start talking about combat. I really feel like Shadows is the ultimate and best version of combat we've seen in any Assassin's Creed game. That may sound like a bold statement to some people, but to me, it just seems like common sense. It's the most fluid the combat has ever been, both animation wise and in terms of general flow. The combat, of course, features your basic systems with dodging and parrying. In addition to those, you got the perfect dodge and the perfect parry. You have your light and heavy attacks, as well as a number of active abilities to use. It is your standard affair as far as combat goes in these types of games, but to me, it is as polished as it's ever been. I will say, however, that locking onto a target makes combat incredibly frustrating as the lock on mechanic automatically switches to other enemies, which causes you to miss swings or hit someone that you weren't even originally going for. Combat encounters usually have you facing up against multiple enemies at once who attack out of turn. I like games that do this so that enemies aren't just standing around waiting for you to kill their friend, but instead actively attempt to attack you mid combat. I think the game does try to mimic combat we've seen in other games that are specific to the samurai style combat, like with the constant parries until you find an opening. Your active abilities, of course, add another layer of depth, and these abilities can be used if you've built up enough adrenaline. Each weapon type has their own active abilities associated with them, so the moves you can pull off will be different depending on what weapon you're wielding. Combat with Yasuke is much different in comparison to combat with Nawe. Nawe feels much more quicker and nimble in combat, allowing her to pull off long combos rather quickly and escape combat just as fast. Yasuke, on the other hand, feels much more slower and methodical. His hits feel chunky while dealing big damage. Me personally, I ended up having a preference for Naoe's combat style as I found her moveset to be more fun to play with. I'll just close this section out by simply saying that the combat is the best this series has ever seen in terms of quality. So I think now would be a good time to start talking about the skill tree. Valhalla was pretty broad with the skill tree, and honestly, that seems like an understatement. For the average gamer, I think it would be safe to say that the options available were likely very overwhelming. Anytime you would unlock a new skill or spend a skill point, you would see another branch opening up dozens of more nodes that you can put points into. This system was quite a divergence from what we saw in games like Odyssey and Origins. To me, this skill system made little to no sense, and to this day, I have no idea exactly what they were going for. Mirage, on the other hand, completely strips away the number of options we have available, and honestly, I found the skill tree in that game to be very lackluster and very unimpactful. Ubisoft really needed some sort of balance, and I think the way Shadows handles its skill tree is more similar to Odyssey than any other game, but of course, there's still quite a bit that sets it apart. For instance, in Shadows, each weapon gets its own skill tree, allowing you to really hone in on a specific style of play. For example, if you're playing as Yasuke and really take a liking to using the long katana, you can focus your build squarely around that. Through the skill tree, you're able to unlock a couple of active abilities for each weapon and level up a number of passive abilities as well. Some of these are global passives that apply to your character as a whole, and others are passives specific to that skill tree alone. Now, a skill tree, of course, behaves very similarly, but with her, you can focus more on your assassination abilities as opposed to your shinobi abilities. I have to say that the system they went with here is fairly well done and pretty efficient. It's not overly complex, but the choices you make are pretty impactful. Sure, increasing your armor piercing by 3% doesn't sound like all that much, but continuing to put points into that passive will eventually have you up to 18%. Tie that in with your equipment, and you'll find yourself ignoring enemy armor almost completely. In addition to spending skill points, you'll need to increase your knowledge rank in order to actually purchase the higher level skills and passives. With that being said, I think this is the best skill tree we've seen in the last couple of AC entries, mainly because of how straightforward it is and also how impactful the choices you make are. The game really allows you to lean into a specific playstyle. Thankfully, you can of course fully reset all your masteries if you find yourself wanting to switch up your current playstyle. Moving on to the loot and equipment system of AC Shadows, there are some good changes here and some not so good. I'll start with the good. The game essentially offers up two weapon slots. If you're playing as Naue, these weapons can either be a katana, a kusarigama, which was my personal favorite, or a tanto. Yasuke, on the other hand, has a broader selection of weapons. These include a long katana, a naginata, and a kanobo. In addition to that, he has the ability to wield ranged weapons like the bow and arrow or a teppo. Naue strangely does not have the ability to wield any long range weapons, but again, I think this falls into creating more use cases for Yasuke that would otherwise not exist if she could. Outside of the weapons you can equip, you also have three actual equipment slots: a helmet, a body armor, and a trinket slot. This loadout system is more simplified than what we saw in Valhalla, where that game also separated your bracers and your boots as well. The loot system itself in Shadows is different, however. Where Valhalla had unique loot that can be upgraded time and time again, Shadows goes for a more RNG loot style. What I mean by that is that you can get any number of items that varies in quality. These items will have a level attached to them and a number of properties like weapon DPS, ability damage, and depending on if the item is legendary or not, it can have a unique perk attached to it, like this Sage's Reach that stacks damage on next hit with each block. From what I can tell, enemies can drop weapons and armor, and of course, they can obviously be found inside chests. This RNG system is something that I personally like because I'm a degenerate looter genre fan, and it scratches a very tiny itch in that sense. Now, the problem I see with this loot system is that even at higher levels, you'll get dropped loot that is nowhere near as good as what you're currently wielding, making the items that get dropped useless other than for crafting parts or for selling for cash. You can also upgrade all of your equipment at your hideout, which I'll touch on the whole hideout thing a bit later, but basically you can engrave perks onto uncommon or greater rarity weapons and armor, allowing you to customize your build a bit further. This is all to say that the loot system is somewhat simple, but you can definitely find some interesting items out in the world and create some interesting combinations. They clearly tried to scale back the whole RPG aspect a bit by simplifying the loadouts you have. Valhalla had a wide variety of armor sets that complement each other to unlock additional perks. Shadows is very much limited in that sense. And while you can have a helmet and body armor that work off one another, there isn't as much options to choose from in comparison. Remember when I said the whole Assassin's Creed experience was refined in my opening? The loadout system is just another example of that. I personally enjoyed what Valhalla had, and I think Shadows scaled back a bit much, but thankfully not to the extent that Mirage had, and Yubi did manage to find a solid middle ground. I have a separate section for mission design because I think it's worth discussing the changes Ubisoft has made here. All right, changes might be the wrong word. We'll try something more like accommodations. Just about every AC game, you'll walk up to an enemy encampment, scout the area, then eventually hunt down your target. This is usually done by climbing somewhere high and marking targets or using your friendly drone. Wait, I mean bird. Anyway, this is usually done to pinpoint areas of interest and ultimately your assassination target. Shadows has completely done away with this, and honestly, I couldn't be happier. Now it has the ability to see through walls essentially and mark enemies as well as identify your main target. This streamlines gameplay substantially in a good way. I was never a fan of standing still, soaring with my bird, then exiting to control my player again. I much prefer this new way of marking and gaining intel. It keeps you in control of your character and doesn't break immersion for the sake of having a feature that honestly probably no one even used. In addition to this change, the game makes it easy to know what you're looking for. When scanning around with the left trigger, you can figure out where the main objective is within a mission area. I'm not too sure how this works lore wise, but if I enter a new area and need to find someone, I can just hold L2 and I guess find them through intuition, I suppose. I don't hate this system at all. I think it's actually quite nice being able to just go straight to your objective. The mission design overall boils down to three different things that you'll basically rinse and repeat for as many hours as you really want. Go to some said area, identify your blue objective with L2, get to the set area and scan enemies to find your target, and finally kill or blow up said target. Once this flow is established early on, you'll come to know what you're looking for quite easily. To be honest, the game doesn't evolve past that. Like I said earlier, it made accommodations, but it didn't make any evolutions. Your moment to moment gameplay and goals are the same as they will always be. That's fair. That's fine because there's only so many ways you can switch up the stealthy formula, and in this particular case, they made it more streamlined. I've noticed some people complaining about the gameplay being boiled down to just looking for a blue dot, but to that, I ask what would be the alternative? Eventually, you'll have to identify your objective one way or another, and personally, I feel like Shadow's efficient approach is the best way to do it. Finding your mission objective on the map is a different story, as Ubisoft has developed what is now called the Scout system. This is essentially a way to reference clues about where your next objective is, and having a scout go into that area and pinpoint that said objective. You don't actually send a physical scout to do this though, it's more so a UAV scan of that specific area of the map. Honestly, I'm not sure what the point of this is just a couple of button presses to finding an objective as opposed to just having it appear on your map once the mission is given. I think this changes based on whether or not you're playing with guidance on or off. I personally played with it off, but still found the whole scout system to be pretty tacked on. Like, if you run out of scouts, you really have two options. That being go to the nearest hideout and purchase some more, or try to find the objective yourself. But being able to buy more scouts just makes the whole system pointless because if I miss the target a few times, there really isn't a consequence to running out of scouts if I can just go and buy some more. Now, if you've watched my Star Wars Outlaws video, you would know that I was hard on that game for not evolving the typical UB formula, and I stand by that simply because Outlaws was a new IP and a chance for UB to do something new. Shadows, on the other hand, is a staple franchise that has its gameplay DNA ingrained deep in its roots. So fans of the series know what to expect even if they've been away from the series for some time. I'll just end this section by saying that I like the accommodations that UB made to the mission design and overall created a more straightforward flow from mission to mission. The actual open world in Shadows is a beautiful rendition of central Japan. The changing seasons is really just Ubisoft flexing their environmental design prowess. Each season gives way to a change in scenery, snow covers the ground and accumulates during the winter months, rain is a near constant during spring, summer temperatures increase vegetation, and the fall season begins to change the colors of the leaves to a variety of vibrant colors. I feel like Yubi really went out of their way with this approach, and I can appreciate the attention to detail they put forth with this design decision. It's really hard to find any fault in the open world design in general, as I genuinely enjoyed roaming around the large scale map that Ubisoft has built out. I guess my one complaint would be that there does seem to be a lot of copy and paste. It almost feels like you're seeing the same villages, temples, and castles pretty much everywhere you go, and some more variety in those designs would have definitely been a big plus. I will say that the map size has definitely been dialed back from the Valhalla days, and that's totally fine with me as I found that map to be overly large for the sake of just being jam packed with content that I feel like more than half of the player base didn't even see. Shadows is definitely more focused in that sense. The locations you visit are all places that the main story quest takes you to. Of course, following just the main story will have you seeing only a fraction of these different regions, so it's up to you to explore each region thoroughly. I say that, but it's worth mentioning that you can go quite a bit while traversing from area to area and not really find any side activity to do. There's a lot of empty space and shadows, and it really draws you into appreciating the world around you and presenting you with a sense of serenity. I'm only going to make this comparison once, but it feels like it took a page out of Ghost of Tsushima's book. Traveling around in that game is a quiet and calm experience for the most part. That open world looked so good that I found myself stopping and staring at what's around me time and time again. Shadows does a bit of the same here. It's not overcrowded with activities, and there are long patches between mission objective where it's just kind of you and your horse traveling through the world. I mentioned this also because it's a far cry from what we've seen in Valhalla and Odyssey, where there would be something new to see or do just a mere 100 meters away from one another. Now, speaking of each region, you can't just freely go into these different areas and expect to walk away with your life. Shadows brings back the level gated areas we've seen in a number of AC games, making it so that you need to level up quite a bit before being able to tackle missions in that specific region. The design choice behind this always seems to be controversial for some reason, but I'm on the side that thinks this particular design is obviously very well suited for this type of game. I wouldn't like it if I can just walk into any region and plow my way through without any regards for an enemy's level. I think there being a level recommendation, not so much a requirement, is good. I personally just like the feeling of becoming more and more powerful as I level up by unlocking new skills and equipping better and better loot to take on those new challenges. Now, you also have your hideout, which I'll very briefly touch on. This whole mechanic is a spin-off of what Valhalla offered. This time around, you get to place buildings and furnishing through like a grid based system, and there seems to be a lot of different design options that can be looted or purchased from merchants. But to be completely honest, I didn't spend much time here. I did not spend much time with the whole hideout mechanic outside of just getting my essential buildings up and running and leveling them up to a point where they were actually useful. Now, generally speaking, the different side activities that are available range from being okay to just flat out bad. Like some activities are painfully pointless and boring that I question how they couldn't come up with something marginally more entertaining. Praying at shrines is just an animation that plays out. There is legitimately nothing more to it. Doing this a number of times marks that particular shrine as complete and grants you a knowledge point. Another activity includes finding lost pages in a temple, which usually just involves you scanning an area for white dots, then maneuvering to get those said lost pages. It's just a bizarre choice to even include these activities, but here we are. Those activities mentioned are the type that gain you knowledge points, but like all other AC games that came before, there is a huge number of temples and castles and strongholds available for you to clear out. That is the bulk of what you'll be doing in your free time, as clearing these areas rewards you with some sort of loot, XP, and attribute points. This is your standard affair that's been a thing since Origins, and honestly, it's pretty copy and paste in Shadows as well. Continuing the topic of side activities, I think it's a good time to mention side quests. Side quests are abundant in Shadows, but overall scaled down in terms of quantity in comparison to Valhalla. Most side quests, as you might have guessed, involve you finding and assassinating a number of individuals, or in the case of Yasuke, dueling other samurais. There are side chains that are related to members of your hideout, and these also vary in quality. And some characters I ended up completely ignoring and didn't even bother doing their side quests. And of course, there's also these contracts you can do, which are a good way to get materials for your hideout, as well as experience and money. This is honestly all just to say that exploring the open world crafted by Yubi is pretty rewarding. You'll often be met with some type of upgrade, whether that be the collection of a knowledge point, discovering a hidden chest, or completing a side mission with a good reward. Now, I've saved talking about the story till the very end. The story in Shadows follows two protagonists, Yasuke and Naue. The two are on different paths and missions, but their stories end up intertwining. Yasuke is on a journey of self discovery, while Naue is motivated by vengeance and her sole purpose is to exact revenge on her father's killer. Throughout the story, we learn how Naue and Yasuke have various things in common and how they're better off being companions rather than enemies. I guess the story, in my opinion, is fine. I didn't feel like there was anything happening that was particularly interesting. Naue's story is pretty straightforward. She wants revenge and she meets a variety of people who lead her to her final goal, but none of what she does or experiences is really worth noting. Her story is just flat, and it can get quite messy with the large cast of characters that can easily be confused if you don't keep track of who is who. There are just so many characters that one questline to assassinate a member of the secret society has you speak to numerous people along the way. And at times, after stepping away from the game for a few hours, I'd completely forget what I was doing. I blame this in particular on the lack of a journal or really any summary of what the heck the quest I'm currently on has me doing or why I'm even doing it. Most of the time, it really just ends up with me having to go to a certain location and killing someone important. But remembering who I just killed and why I did it, it's a challenge within itself. Yasuke's story is pretty similar in terms of quality. His tale follows how he became a samurai of Lord Nobunaga, originally a bodyguard for the Portuguese missionaries. Nobunaga took a liking to Yasuke and had him trained to be a full fledged samurai. So, Yasuke's story early on follows this journey, and I think that story in particular is interesting to follow, but it still ends up mixed in the overall plot, along with Naue's story as well. The main story just ends up being a long list of quests that are tied to specific members of the secret society, Each member will have you doing anywhere between 2 and 4 quests before eventually finding your target. This gets rinsed and repeated for each member. Now, my main issue with this approach is that none of their stories are interconnected. You can find yourself doing missions that lead to 3 completely different targets, and it can get very convoluted and confusing if you don't keep track of who you're trying to assassinate. There's just a general disconnect in the flow of the story. I'm not sure if this was only a me problem, but it's something that I was constantly annoyed by. Quality wise, I'd say the story overall is just pretty average. Towards the end, it obviously picks up a little bit because we're more focused on a singular storyline. Overall, I actually like Naue. I think she's a very solid addition to the AC list of main characters, but Yasuke overall, his story felt pretty tacked on. Now, let's move on to performance. On PS5, in performance mode, the game ran flawlessly. I don't think the game ever dropped below 60 FPS for me, and the resolution looked pretty good too. There weren't any noticeable blurry textures or popping that I dealt with during my time with the game. One issue I did have was that the game would automatically switch to quality mode when I was visiting a hideout, and this would make the game run at 30 FPS. This change was always pretty jarring, and honestly, seeing the game in 30 FPS was just hard to play. Overall, though, the performance was very rock solid. So clearly, Ubisoft prioritized optimization during their delay window, and honestly, it paid off. I found the game to run perfectly. All right, so I think I went on a bit long here, so let's just wrap this video up. I'll end this by saying that I think Assassin's Creed Shadows is a very solid entry and probably the best gameplay experience that this series has ever seen. Everything about the game has been refined and streamlined to make your moment to moment experience more flawless. The game does have a number of missteps, like adding an additional main character who goes against the game's namesake, some questionable side activities, and having a somewhat dull and disconnected story. But there are many other things that the game does well. The open world is beautifully crafted, the combat and parkour experience is very well done, and the removal of unneeded bulk was very much needed. Overall, AC Shadows is a good game that deals with some identity issues, but still one that I enjoyed my time with. I'll be interested to see how the opinion on the game ages from the player base. I do know that the game came out to a baptism by fire, so to speak. I scrolled on X regarding the game, and there seemed to be a general consensus around the game. And I'll just end my video by saying that if you do intend on playing any game, the best way to do it is to maybe look at a couple of review scores, not read or watch an actual review, then go in and form your own individual opinion. With that being said, thank you all for watching as always. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll see you all in the next one.